A man stood on the western bank of an ice-cold German river at 4 in the morning, doing nothing. He gave no orders. He did not pace. He did not speak to the officers who stood a respectful distance behind him. He simply watched the black water move hour after hour, in the freezing dark of a March night in 1945. This man commanded 40,000 soldiers. He had tanks, artillery, an entire army waiting on his word. And yet there he stood, alone at the edge of the water, waiting for a single sergeant to come back from the other side. To understand why one of the most aggressive generals of the entire war refused to wait somewhere warm that night, you first have to understand what one man had volunteered to do, and why it could never have been ordered, only chosen. The river was 40 meters wide. In March in Germany, the water temperature hovered right around 4 degrees Celsius, just barely above freezing. The current ran strong and fast, fed by the spring snowmelt pouring down from the mountains upstream, and the Germans were on the far side. They had been dug in on the far side for 3 days. Patton needed to know what was waiting over there before he committed 40,000 men to crossing. At 11 o'clock that night, Sergeant Michael Dolan knocked on his commanding officer's door with a request that no sane man would make. His CO looked up at him. Dolan said he would go across that night, alone, and be back before dawn with everything they needed to know. His CO studied him for a long moment, the kind of silence in which a commander weighs whether the man in front of him is brave or simply tired of living. Then he said, "You have until 4. Not a minute passed. Dolan went into the water at 11:30. He would spend 22 minutes crossing, 90 minutes on the German side, and 31 minutes fighting his way back. When he finally dragged himself out onto the western bank, his hands had stopped working the way hands are supposed to work. And when he stood up, Patton himself was standing 20 meters away on the bank, in the dark, waiting for him. To grasp what Dolan swam into that night, you have to understand what that river meant in the spring of 1945. The war in Europe was grinding toward its final months. Germany was collapsing inward, squeezed from the east by the advancing Soviets and from the west by the Allies. This river was the last great natural barrier standing between the Western Allied armies and the industrial heart of Germany itself. The Germans knew it better than anyone. They had spent months turning the eastern bank into a fortress, and not improvised positions either, but prepared ones, the kind that take months of labor to construct, with overlapping fields of fire and artillery positioned to rake every possible approach. Every bridge across had already been destroyed or wired for demolition. This was not merely a river, it was the last line, and Patton's Third Army was about to throw itself against it. 40,000 men, vehicles, artillery, supply lines stretching back for miles. The crossing would commit everything Patton had, and the single decision of where to cross would determine how many of those 40,000 men would ever see home again. In Patton's sector, there were 2 realistic crossing points still in contention. One town to the north, another to the south. A third option further down the river had already been ruled out by intelligence. The entire weight of the decision came down to those 2 remaining choices. And here was the problem that made the whole thing so dangerous. 2 separate intelligence reports had come in, and they flatly contradicted each other. The first report claimed the northern town was only lightly defended, that the main German concentration sat further south, and that the north offered the cleanest crossing opportunity in the whole sector. The second report said the exact opposite, that the bluff above the northern town was far more heavily fortified than it appeared from the air, and that it was the southern town that showed signs of thin manning. 2 reports, 2 completely opposite answers, and tens of thousands of lives hanging on which one was correct. If the first report was right and they crossed in the north, the casualties would be bearable. But if the first report was wrong, if that northern bluff was as fortified as the second report warned, then every man crossing there would be walking blind into a killing zone he could not see until it was far too late to turn back. Sergeant Michael Dolan read both reports. He understood exactly what their disagreement meant in human terms. And then he walked to his commanding officer and volunteered to settle the question with his own body. Now you need to understand who Michael Dolan was, because no ordinary soldier makes that walk. He was 26 years old, born in Boston to parents who had crossed over from County Mayo in Ireland in the early 1920s. His father had broken his back working the Boston docks until he had saved enough to open a small hardware store. His mother had kept the house and raised the children. They had spoken Irish at home and English everywhere else, and Dolan had grown up straddling two worlds the way the children of immigrants always seem to, never fully belonging to either, fluent in both. He had been in the army since 1942. North Africa first, then Sicily, then the slow, bloody, grinding climb up the spine of Italy, then France, Belgium, and finally Germany. 3 full years of war. And in those 3 years, he had absorbed things that no training manual could ever teach a man. He had learned how to read terrain in total darkness by feel and instinct. He had learned how to move through water without making a single betraying sound. And most of all, he had learned to hear the difference in how soldiers sound when they know an attack is coming versus when they have no idea. That last skill was not something you could be taught. It was something the war carved into you over 1,000 nights of listening. He had grown up around water, the harbor and the rivers of Boston, swimming since before he could properly walk, and he spoke German. Not formal, textbook German, but the rough, functional German that comes from 3 years of crouching in the dark within earshot of the enemy, where understanding the muttered words of the man across the field could mean the difference between living and dying. He had every single qualification this impossible task required, and he knew it. That was precisely why he could not let another man go in his place. When he told his CO his plan, the officer pushed back hard. The river was 40 meters wide and near freezing. There were German positions on both banks. What, his CO demanded, did Dolan think he could possibly find that aerial reconnaissance had missed? Dolan answered simply. He could hear things that cameras could never capture. Then he added the detail that ended the argument. He could understand enough German to listen. His CO went quiet for a long moment, then gave him until 4 in the morning and not 1 minute longer. Dolan stripped down to the bare minimum. Dark clothing, nothing that could reflect light, nothing that could make a sound. A small knife, a waterproof pouch holding a notebook and a pencil. He deliberately took no weapon beyond that knife, because he understood the arithmetic of capture. If the Germans found him on their side of the river carrying a rifle, it would end one way. Found unarmed, it would still end badly, but differently, and that difference might be the thin margin he needed. He walked to the bank at 11:15 and stood there for a moment, looking at the water that he was about to trust with his life. Then he went in. The cold did not arrive the way cold arrives when you leap into a chilly pool on a summer day. It arrived the way cold arrives when there is no escape from it, no warm towel waiting, no choice but to keep moving forward into more of it. He swam. It took him 22 minutes to cross 40 meters of water, not because he was slow, but because he moved the way a man moves when a single wrong sound means the end of absolutely everything. He came ashore on the German bank roughly 200 meters downstream from where he had entered, carried by the current. He lay flat in the shallows for 2 full minutes, doing nothing but listening, letting his ears adjust to the new world he had entered. Then he rose and spent 90 minutes learning the very thing the 2 reports could not agree upon. He worked his way inland from the eastern bank, perhaps 300 meters, moving in slow increments, freezing in place every 30 seconds to listen. For the first quarter of an hour, he heard nothing useful. Then voices reached him, German soldiers, but not shouting, not on alert. They were talking, and the way they were talking told him everything. It was the loose, easy murmur of men who have held a position so long that the danger has faded into routine. Men whose alertness had softened into something almost comfortable. He knew that exact sound from the inside, because he had made it himself, in quiet sectors of France where the front had moved on, and the waiting had become its own kind of slow occupation. This was the northern town. He crept toward the voices until he could hear them with perfect clarity without being seen, and he began to count. He counted the positions by the sound of them, the direction the patrols moved, the spacing between the voices. He scratched it all into the waterproof notebook with fingers that were already beginning to stiffen. Then he turned south toward where the second town should be if the map burned into his memory was accurate. It was. After 45 minutes of careful movement, he had reached an entirely different stretch of the bank, and what he heard there was nothing like what he had heard in the north. There was no relaxed, settled murmur of comfortable men. There was something else entirely. He could locate two positions clearly by their sound. But between those two positions there was nothing. Not the easy, contented silence of men who have settled into a long routine, but a tighter, thinner silence. The silence of men who are fewer than they should be, men who are painfully aware of the gaps yawning between them. If you have spent enough nights in the dark listening, you can hear the difference between those two kinds of quiet as plainly as you can hear a gunshot. He noted it carefully. Then he turned around and faced the river again. He had been on the German side for 90 minutes. The cold had been steadily working its way deeper into him the entire time. He entered the water at a new point, this time fighting his way upstream against the current, rather than letting it carry him. His arms were already exhausted from the first crossing. The return took 31 minutes. Somewhere around the 20-minute mark, he stopped being able to think clearly about individual strokes and could only fix his entire mind on one thing: the bank. Just reaching the bank, just one more pull toward the bank. He hauled himself out of the shallows on the western side and lay there for what he guessed was about 30 seconds, though he could no longer trust his sense of time at all. Then he stood up, and there, 20 meters away in the dark, stood Patton. Dolan said afterward that his first thought was that he was hallucinating, because he had heard what the cold could do to a man's mind. He stood and stared. The figure on the bank did not move. Then Patton spoke and told him to get out of the water. Patton's aide produced a blanket from somewhere and Dolan took it, but his hands were shaking, and not the ordinary shiver of being cold. This was the deep, violent shaking that comes from somewhere inside the body, the kind that does not stop because you will it to. He could not work the waterproof pouch open. The aide opened it for him and put the notebook in his hands, and Dolan looked down at his own fingers as though they belonged to a stranger. Then he looked at Patton and delivered the answer he had nearly died to obtain. The reports on the northern town were wrong. Patton asked how wrong. Dolan told him the position on the northern bluff was at least twice the strength anyone had estimated. The artillery was well dug in. They had been given the time to prepare, and you could hear it in the very way they spoke, the sound of settled men who feared nothing. He set the notebook down because his hands were shaking too badly to read his own handwriting, and he gave the rest from memory. The southern town was different. Two positions he could pinpoint, but between them, gaps, fewer men. And then he said the thing that revealed the depth of what he had done. The sound at the southern town was not the same as the sound in the north. Patton told him to explain. Dolan said that in the north, the men sounded like soldiers who knew exactly what was coming and had been there long enough to stop being afraid of it, and that was the signature of a fully prepared position. But in the south, the quiet was a different quiet altogether. It was the quiet of men who knew there were not enough of them, and you could hear that, he said, if you knew what to listen for. Patton was silent for a long time. He looked out at the dark water sliding past. Then he said, "You swam that river in March in the dark to listen." Dolan said, "Yes, sir." Patton said, "And you came back." Dolan said he had told him he would. Patton was quiet again. Then he gave his decision in a single word, the name of the southern town. Not a question, a decision. Then he told Dolan to get warm, to get his hands back, and to brief the crossing officers himself at 6 o'clock. Everything he had heard. As Patton turned to walk back up the bank toward his command post, he stopped and asked the sergeant's name. Dolan told him. Patton repeated it once, quietly, then walked away into the dark. Dolan stood watching him go, then sank down onto the bank and sat there until his hands had steadied enough to hold the notebook again. The briefing at 6 in the morning lasted 40 minutes. Dolan spoke from memory and from the notebook, position by position, everything he had heard, everything he had counted, and what the silence itself had told him in each place. The crossing officers fired questions at him, and he answered everyone. When it was finished, one of them looked at him and asked how he could possibly have known what the silence meant. Dolan answered that 3 years of listening to the wrong kind of silence eventually teaches you exactly what the right kind sounds like. The crossing at the southern town took place the following night, 36 hours after Dolan had dragged himself out of that river. The German positions were precisely where he had said they would be. The gaps were exactly where he had said they would be. The crossing succeeded, and the casualties came in far below any estimate that had been calculated for any location in the sector. Later, when the intelligence report that had favored the northern town was compared against the actual defenses found there, the northern bluff turned out to be almost exactly twice as strong as the report had claimed. Had the Third Army crossed in the north, the lists of the dead would have read very differently. Patton's own log from that night recorded the entire affair in 5 words at 15 minutes past 4 in the morning. The town's name, confirmed, and the time of the briefing. No description of what Dolan had done. No reflection on the river. No mention at all of the 40 minutes Patton had stood on that freezing bank refusing to leave. His aide, however, kept a fuller account. He wrote the next day that he had watched the general stand on the western bank for 40 minutes that night, and that Patton did not pace, did not speak, and gave no orders. He simply stood and watched the water. He had driven himself to the bank, not because the crossing demanded his presence there, but because a man had gone into that river on the strength of his word, and Patton would not wait somewhere warm while it happened. When Dolan finally emerged, the aide wrote, Patton looked at him for several seconds before speaking, and what was on his face was not quite relief. It was something harder than relief. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who has just watched another man do something that can never be commanded, only chosen. Dolan received the Distinguished Service Cross. He came home to Boston in October of 1945 and went back to work in his father's hardware store on the south side of the city. He stayed there for 32 years. And in all those years, he never once spoke about the river, not to his customers, not to the men at the Veterans Hall who recited their own wars every Friday evening from their familiar stools. Dolan sat with them and listened, but he never added his own story to the pile. His daughter only discovered the truth in the 1970s. She had been reading a history of the river crossings for a college course when she came across a single paragraph describing an unnamed intelligence action in the Third Army sector. One soldier, the water, the night, the information that changed where an entire army crossed. She came home and looked at her father across the dinner table and asked him plainly if it had been him. He looked down at his plate and said only that he had gone into the water, come back, and told the general what he heard and that the rest had been other people. She said, "You saved lives." He thought about that for a while, then said he had been cold for about 2 hours. He looked down at his hands the way he sometimes did, and told her that the cold had never fully left them. Some mornings, he said, he still woke with his hands the way they had been in that water. That, he told her, was what he had kept from it. She never asked him again. He died in 1999, 80 years old, in the same Boston hardware store that had been his father's, then his, and by then his son's. On the wall behind the counter hung a photograph of a young man in uniform, unsmiling, the way men in uniform photographs in 1943 so rarely smiled. For 30 years, most customers never asked about it. The few who did were told only that it was his father, that he had been in the war, and nothing more. Because to a stranger there was nothing more that needed saying. The river is still 40 meters wide. It is still bitterly cold in March. It is still the very same water that nearly took Michael Dolan's life. The only difference now is that no one waits on the far bank in the dark anymore. So here is the question worth sitting with. If you had stood on that bank that night, knowing the cold and the current and what waited on the other side, would you have gone into the water? Tell us in the comments. And if you want more stories about who people truly were beneath the uniforms history barely remembers, subscribe.